Good evening and welcome to another edition of US in the City with our interviews with famous people, great people, insightful people. And this evening is no exception whatsoever. We are very happy to be inviting into this fireside chat Lord Leigh, Baron Howard Leigh, to be precise, of Hurley in Berkshire, which is very close to my heart because I'm from Reading, off the M4 near Slough. Lord Leigh is a very esteemed professional, not only a senior partner at Cavendish Corporate Finance, but also senior treasurer of the Conservative Party and also a member of the House of Lords. It's a pleasure to welcome Lord Leigh.
How very kind of you. Thank you. What an honor to be included in such an august audience.
Lovely to have you with us. It's great to have you, and I know you to be incredibly affable, warm, and thank you for being generous with your time this evening. And I guess
does that mean you're more like Cecil Parkinson than Piers Morgan on these sort of things?
I think I am.
Oh, good.
I think that's my remit. I'm being held back, straitjacketed by the role of rabbi, who is the model of a country parson here in Radlett. And I wanted to first kick off, maybe if you could tell us a bit about your background, your childhood, where you came from, where it all began.
Oh, well, okay. Well, I'll do the short bit truncated as far as possible. But I grew up from the age of to the age of about 6 or 7 in Hampstead Garden suburb. So I was a Norris Leanick, and then Highgate. And but I went to school first at Lyndhurst House, which was a prep school with 97% Jewish kids, and then to Clifton College, Bristol, which Clifton College was very interesting because it had a Jewish house in a non-Jewish school, and that was very character forming. It was very clever of them because it meant that the Jews were all restricted to 10% of the school. That's only one Jewish house out of 10. But it enabled us to go to synagogue when they went to chapel. We had kosher food. It was a great model, which worked very well and enabled me to form extremely strong friendships from the age of 13 to 18. I then went to university, became a chartered accountant for my sins, and eventually jumped out of that to form Cavendish Corporate Finance when I was 29, which has become a leading M&A advisory house.
Incredible. And that was all in the early 80s.
Yeah, I was very much inspired by Lady Thatcher, Maggie Thatcher's, and Norman Tebbett's "Get on Your Bike," and there was a culture in the very late 80s of you can do it, and it was the norm then more so than now for people to stay in large companies if they wanted to be successful and go up the ladder. And even though I was at a very large firm of accountants, and to be a partner of one of those firms of accountants was regarded as a top of the tree, I still felt that I could do my own thing, become an entrepreneur, and it was liberating and exciting, ridiculously risk-taking, and I would never advise anyone else to do it, but that's what happens when you're 29. You do things that 62-year-olds say don't do, thankfully.
Indeed. And then you actually started at a firm called Deloitte Haskins and Sells.
I wasn't sure what to do after university, and a friend said, a friend of mine called Johnny Levy said, well, come along and meet the recruitment partner of Deloitte Haskins and Sells. And such were things so different in those days that I walked into his office on a sunny summer's evening, way after all the milk round and everything, for a chat. And he only asked me 2 questions. First, where did you go to school? Second, who audits your father's business? And I seem to have answered both satisfactorily because he offered me a job there and then, and I started a couple of months later. So those days, halcyon days, I mean, I've never have been admitted to such a fine firm nowadays when they have all sorts of tests and psychiatric assessments and heaven knows what. But in those halcyon days, you could drift in.
Wow, amazing, incredible. And I thought I would go further into this. You essentially started off that business, went into this corporate finance world, and mergers and acquisitions became your specialty?
Yes, I qualified as a tax advisor, Chartered Institute of Tax, but I got a bit bored by that, and it was a bit brainy. So I thought I'd do this M&A thing, which essentially is what you would call corporate shotgun. And it's finding people who want to sell businesses and then finding people who want to buy businesses. And it gets some fancy titles, but that's what it is. And in the mid-'80s, the accountancy firms were finding their own way. And I actually became the first ever chartered accountant to do a contingent transaction, which was quite something. And the first deal I ever did was selling a fish company to a company called Hillsdown, that some of you may remember. And Hillsdown was run by the most marvelous man, Sir Harry Solomon. And it turned out that my girlfriend at the time, sister, was Sir Harry's secretary. So she mentioned to her that I was coming in to see Harry. And when I got out of the lift into the Hillsdown reception, Harry's secretary came rushing out to me and gave me a big kiss on both cheeks. And my fish client said to me, "Ooh, these Hillsdown people, they're very friendly, aren't they?" And Harry and I had never met, but we met each other across the table and we recognized kindred spirits, became firm friends for life. And we closed the first ever contingent transaction for the accountancy firm in 1986, I think it was.
Wow. There's a little bit of interference. I'm not sure if there's a fan blowing or something.
Let me try and make it a bit easier. That's better.
Okay. Okay, fine. We're going to carry on. So thank you for those insights into the early days and the business ventures. And I guess what I wanted to get to next was the politics, because you have had quite the journey becoming acquainted with and involved in British politics. And I think a lot of people would like to know how that journey began and how it developed.
Well, like most things in life, pretty much by chance. One day I was sitting at my desk and the phone went, and a young lady in a very cut glass accent asked me if I'd like to give £1,000 to the Conservative Party. And I'd always been a Conservative. I actually canvassed in 1979 first when I was at university. So when she asked, I said, well, I would, but I'm not in a position at this time to give you £1,000. Why don't I give you £500 now and £500 in 6 months? And she agreed to that. So I started giving them £500 every 6 months. And I went to all the events. And at one of the events, I bumped into Michael Ashcroft, now Lord Ashcroft. And I said to him, you know what, I've been giving you £1,000 for a couple of years or so, and no one's ever upsold me to pay more. He said, I want to speak to you. And he took me out for dinner, and my wife. And as we were sat around the dinner table, he invited me to become a treasurer of the party. And despite the fact that my shins were getting black and blue from my wife kicking me, muttering under her breath, don't do it, I agreed. And you have to remember, this was at a very difficult time for the party. It's difficult to remember now, but when he asked me to join, William Hague was become treasurer. William Hague was leader. We were over 20 points behind in the polls. Blair was in his full plomb, invincible, and it was a tough gig. But I loved William. He is a fantastic bloke, great fun. And so I agreed to become a treasurer. And a little while after that, Michael said to me he's appointing 13 people as treasurer and I would be one. And a couple of years after that, he rang me up and said, by the way, Howard, he said, I've just sacked the 12 of the other treasurers. Oh, I said, why is that? He said, well, none of them brought any money in, but as you are bringing money in, I'd like you to stay. So I said, well, what are they doing? He said, well, they were just wandering around with business cards, calling themselves treasurers, not actually doing anything. So I stayed. And by luck and circumstance, every time there was a change of treasurer or change of leader, it changed to someone I was comfortable with or I got on with or had a particular relationship with. And they asked me to stay. And I worked my way through. I've now been a treasurer of the party for 20 years, senior treasurer for 10. And I think that's, apparently, I'm told that's a record time for anyone to have that job.
Wow, that's incredible. And have you a lot? I know you sent me. Well, let's go further down that journey then. I think first, the House of Lords. I mean, you became a peer, and we'd like to know how.
Well, in my journey with various leaders, which we can come back to if you like, I was raising money, and I tapped up a friend of mine called Andrew Feldman, and Andrew said to me, he said, look, I am a Tory and I will support you. He said, but this would have been 2000, 2003. He said, but I'm still at an early stage of my career and I'm not really ready to do much. And he said, and by the way, one of my really good mates from Oxford's just become an MP. Why don't we have dinner with him? So I said, Andrew, I can't have dinner with every MP. There's hundreds of them. He said, no, this fellow's very special. Let's have dinner. So in 2002, 2003, David Cameron, Andrew Feldman and I had dinner together, just the three of us. And Cameron said to me, so party fundraising, he said, money just comes in, doesn't it? I said, David, let me talk you through it. It's not like that at all. So we became friends, and then when Andrew said, well, what do you think of Cameron? And I said, well, he's a very lovely fellow, wonderful guy, but far too young to be anything like leader now. And so when Michael Howard unexpectedly left and opened up the race, Andrew said, come on, you've got to support Cameron. I said, that'd be ridiculous. He's far too young. He's never going to make it. And Andrew started writing big checks. I said, Andrew, steady on, mate. You know, Cameron's not going to make it. He'll do well, but he's not going to make it. And of course, Cameron became leader. And to his credit, he turned around to me, knowing I hadn't supported him, and said, Howard, I'd like you to stay on as treasurer. Would you be interested? So I said, sure, great, thank you. And it was a huge pleasure to work with Cameron. He's a fantastic fellow. And I did that for a few years. And Andrew became chairman of the party, and he became senior treasurer. And Andrew and I have been very close friends. He's a member of my shul. And one day he said to me, he said, you know, Howard, he said, and this would have been about 2011, 2012. He said, you know, Howard, you know you're on the list. I said, blimey, am I? What have I done? He said, no. He said, you're on the list of one of the people they're thinking of putting in the House of Lords. I said, you're joking, really? He said, yeah. You've served as treasurer then for 12 years or something. That's what they're thinking. So having started from just giving 500 quid and just doing what I thought was the right thing to do, I was amazed. And then I got a phone call from Tom Strathclyde, Lord Strathclyde, who was a hereditary peer who was leader of the House. They said, Howard, will you come for lunch with me? And I said, sure. And he said at lunch, he said, well, Howard, he said, I gather you might be interested in further public service. I said, am I? He said, yes. He said, further public, we were sitting in the House of Lords, further public service, as in, oh, yeah, oh, right, yes, thank you. Well, that would be very, very nice. Thank you very much. I'd love to do that. And then I can remember the date. It was the 12th of December, 2012. So it was a very easy date to remember, 12/12/12. I got a phone call from David Cameron who said, Howard, he said, I am compiling the list of people to go in the House of Lords, and I'm minded to put your name to Her Majesty to be elevated to the peerage. Would you accept? Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. I'd be thrilled. And he said, that's fine. He said, that's great. We'll sort out the formalities. He said, but there's just one thing. He said, and that is, until it's announced, you must not tell anyone. Understood? I said, of course, Prime Minister. Thank you, Prime Minister. Absolutely, Prime Minister. Next phone call. Hello, Mum. I've got some news for you. And she said, yes, darling. She said, I know. I said, no, Mum. You can't know this. This is news. She said, darling, I know. I said, how can you know? She said, because I'm your mother. I know, darling. You and Jennifer are having another baby, aren't you? So I told her and my wife, and that was it. And they both kept stum. And from the 12th of December 12 till the 1st of August 2013, a long time before it was announced, we all kept stum, but it was announced on 1st of August that I'd been elevated to the peerage, and the Queen had consented to sign the letters patent appointing me as Baron Leigh of Hurley. I did get a phone call actually from the Lord Chancellor, who was Chris Grayling, who's Minister of Justice at that time. And he rang me up and he said, Howard, he said, I've got some letters patent in front of me I'm supposed to sign as Lord Chancellor, which is to be co-signed by Her Majesty the Queen, making you Baron Leigh of Hurley. He said, not sure if I should sign that. So I said, I tell you what, Chris, who was a good mate, I said, I tell you what, I said, why don't you cross out Baron and put in Duke? Oh, he said, could do, he said, but I think that would make you sound a bit like a jazz player, so we won't do that. So he duly signed, and Elizabeth R. duly signed, and then I was elevated, and the very first thing I had to do was to go and see the Garter of the coat of arms to have my nomes dignitatis, my name and my coat of arms, and we went as a family to discuss it. And Garter allocates you to a herald, and I was allocated to a herald, the Herald of Lancaster, whose name was Robert John Baptist Noel. That's his name. And I said, and Robert John Baptist Noel said to me, "Would you like a logo and underneath your coat of arms?" And I said, "Yes, I would actually. I've got something in mind." What's that? I said, "Well, I would like to have the words, 'If not now, when?'" And Robert John Baptist Noel said, "Would you like that in English or Hebrew?" And he said it in Hebrew.
He knew it.
He knew it. And I was absolutely bowled over. I said, "How did you know that, Harold?" He said, "Well," he said, "I was the only non-Jew in my year at Oxford reading Semitic studies."
Oh, wow.
So and he said to me that in days gone by, gentlemen who were appointed to the peerage, learned people, would often have their coat of arms in Latin or Greek or Hebrew. It was quite common.
Yeah.
So that's what happened.
Incredible. And you work with top treasurers, Calms, Marlon, Spencer, et al.
Yeah, very, very curiously, by happenstance, Lord Calms, Lord Spencer, and others, one of those random things, really. And that was Stanley was. Many of you will know Stanley. Stanley was very challenging, and he asked me what I did, and I explained I'm a corporate finance advisor in the world of mergers and acquisitions. Oh, he said, "Right, so you're a business broker." I said, "Well, okay, if you like, Stanley." But of course, Stanley and I formed a great relationship because I delivered, and he had a really tough gig. He was supporting Ian Duncan Smith, and that was really tough. But Stanley did as best he could. And I went through lots of other treasurers thereafter, 2 or 3 years. The chief treasurer. I'm not the chief treasurer. And there's a reason I'm not the chief treasurer. The chief treasurer typically gives the party £1 or £2 million a year, and typically underwrites the party if there's a problem. So I'm not the chief treasurer. I'm the senior treasurer who does not do that, but does a lot of the work.
Good job.
And in fact, when Cameron asked me to be senior treasurer, I said that you have to have Michael Spencer as chief treasurer. And he agreed to do that. And Michael Spencer was the most fabulous chief treasurer.
Wow. And you've worked with some of the major leading lights at the top of the Conservative Party in terms of the politicians. Not only William Hague, IDS, Michael Howard, David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris. Any insights into any of them?
Well, William was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, just a clever man. And if you watch back any of his PMQs, he used to take Tony Blair apart every time at PMQs. And he used to do things like he'd go into PMQs and he'd start, and Tony Blair would come with this file of all the answers in his little sort of booklet. So William would start off a question all about aardvarks. So Tony Blair would go to the front of the file on the A and look up aardvarks, and he'd rabble on about aardvarks. And just as he was sitting down, he'd say, "And so, Prime Minister, how does this affect the matter of zoology?" So Tony Blair would have to go all the way down to Z and find out what he's supposed to do. And he was just a clever, William had remained an extremely close friend. And he's just a clever, funny, witty man. And it was, but he wasn't successful. It drained him. It took a lot out of him being leader of the party. It was a tough gig, but I became extremely friendly with him and Fionn, and to this day. And he was followed, as you know, by Ian Duncan Smith, who not many people realise is an absolutely passionate Zionist and is a great friend of the Jewish people. And it didn't work for Ian Duncan Smith, but he became a completely changed man, because one day when he was leader, he went to a sink estate in Glasgow, and he saw how people were living on this sink estate, which was below any standard of living you could possibly imagine. And it affected him very much. And he made a commitment to do something to help people in such circumstances. And he founded the Centre for Social Justice, which still exists to this day. And Ian has devoted his life to social justice and helping those at the bottom of the ladder. And people don't think that about Ian, but that's the sort of person he was. He came from a very distinguished military family. His family were imperialists in China and India. His father was the most decorated Spitfire pilot, and he's a great man. And in fact, last election I went to canvass for him in Chingford because he needed help, and I gave it to him. And in fact, the reason Ian stood down was because the party was running out of money, and we had to say to him, "We haven't got any money. We're going to go bust." And so we needed a new leader. And Michael Howard came along, and you may remember he gave the party a huge lift. And Michael's a complicated fellow. He's also highly intelligent. As you know, he has strong Jewish roots, and he told me he was brought up from, but he went to Cambridge, and at Cambridge, he said his eyes opened and a different world emerged to him. And he dropped his fromness, although he never ever denies his religion. He was always very close to his mother, who only died a few years ago. And he could be in a meeting of the utmost importance and crucial matter, and an aide would come in and whisper in his ear, and it would be his mum on the phone. He'd go out and take it. He was a great guy. And although he had no exterior sort of Judaism to the world, I don't think, or maybe he did, he would religiously go to shul to say Kaddish for his parents, come what may. And people ask me if there's anti-Semitism in the party, and I remember at one conference, just before Michael was elected, someone coming up to me and saying, "That fellow Michael Howard, can't have him as leader of the party." And I'd say, "Why not?" "Well, you don't want that sort of person as a leader of a party, do you?" I said, "Well, I wouldn't have a problem. Why on earth would you have a problem with Michael Howard?" "Well," they said, he's Welsh. You can't have a Welshman in charge of a party, can you?"
Classic.
It was absolutely true. And Michael did his bit. The 2015 election didn't go quite as well as it might have done, but Michael was very clever, and he stood down in a way that allowed the people he had appointed, particularly George Osborne and David Cameron, to take over. And don't forget, at the time, it was an absolute shoo-in that David Davis would win it. Absolute shoo-in. And Cameron was a rank outsider, and nobody thought he'd do it. But he ran a brilliant campaign, which was the first time that Linton Crosby got involved in campaigning, and they ran a brilliant campaign. And Cameron, you remember at conference, did that speech without any notes that was superb. And he wowed them. And David Davis was a shambles, an absolute shambles. And I probably would have left being involved in the party if David Davis had become leader. But I was inspired by Cameron to want to stay. And there's no better word for it than Cameron's just an absolute mensch. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. And we didn't agree on one particular thing, which was Brexit. Cameron, as you know, was a Remainer. He wasn't really as strong a Remainer as he made out. He was actually quite Eurosceptic, but he voted Remain and canvassed Remain. He was on a high. He'd won the Scottish election. He'd won the mayoral election. He'd won the AV vote. And we all said to him, "Don't do it." Even people like me who were Brexiteers said, "Don't do it now. Wait." But he felt he had to get on with it, so he did it. And it didn't work out well, as you know. And a day or two after the Brexit vote, by chance, that was the Conservative Summer Party. And we were all gathered together at the Hurlingham Club. And it was the most incredible evening, because it was literally 2 days after the vote. And the pound had crashed, and the stock exchange had crashed, and we were going to hell in a handcart, and he'd resigned, and the whole thing was absolute chaos. And he went round the room, and he came to our table, and he looked at me, and he said, "Still happy you voted Brexit?" And I sort of nodded yes. And then he went round to see my wife Jennifer, who really adored David. And David had just stood down, and Jennifer welled up into tears when David came round to see her. And David put his arms around her, and he said, "Jennifer," he said, "don't worry about me. It's just politics. I'll be fine." What a guy.
Yeah, maybe.
So he made Jennifer feel really well. And then, of course, everyone expected a strong Brexiteer to be the next leader, Andrea Leadsom or Liam Fox or someone like that.
Or Boris Johnson.
Or Boris. In fact, Boris and Michael were absolutely... and Michael was on my table that night on the dinner. And Michael was that night was about to do the deal with Boris, and we all said to Michael, "Where's Boris?" And that was the night Michael was supposed to give Boris. Boris was supposed to give Michael the letter telling him what the deal, and Boris never made it. And Michael decided that night after dinner, sitting next to Jennifer, not to stand against Boris. So we were really seeing history being made. And that night it didn't happen. And as you know, Hurley, because you are a Berkshire boy, Hurley is very close to the town of
Henley, Ned.
No. After the station after Reading to London is.
Oh, I haven't been on that for a long time. Slough?
Maidenhead.
I said Maidenhead.
Did you? I beg your pardon. So you're right. Absolutely right. And so when I got a house here about 10 years ago, the first thing I did is join Maidenhead Conservative Association, and I became a treasurer of Maidenhead Conservative Association, which is a very splendid institution of wonderful folk. And so, and of course, the sitting MP was a backbencher called Theresa May, who I became friendly with. So by complete chance, the next leader of the party was someone I was very close to. And I was really close to Theresa. I'm really close to Theresa because I live in her constituency and did a lot of local events with her. And so she and I really are mates. We've been to each other's houses and so on. And again, she's not entirely what you see. She does have a great sense of humor. She's certainly got a tremendous sense of civic duty and to do the right thing. She's a cleric's daughter, so what more can you ask? And she knows her Bible. And someone asked her, who in the Bible does she relate to most? And her answer in a meeting, her answer was Ruth.
Wow.
So she really knows the stuff. And we became mates. She has a sense of humor most of the time. Sometimes it fails. So she, as you know, one of her big things is campaigning on modern slavery. And she and I were having a discussion about something or other. And she said, I've got to go because there's a debate on modern slavery and I'm speaking. Oh, I said, for or against? And she didn't find it funny. I thought it was quite good. But anyway, it was a shame. It was a great shame. Basically, she was badly let down by Nick Timothy and Fiona Cunningham, badly let down by people who wrote a terrible manifesto without consultation. And it wasn't to be. So the person whom we know was Boris Johnson. Now, funnily enough, when the Mayoral of London campaign was beginning to start, I was asked by Francis Maude to help think who could be potential Mayor of London after Ken Livingstone. And we actually did go through quite a lot of candidates of people we thought we'd ask, and they either wouldn't accept or they weren't suitable. And it was at another Tory party where I found myself sitting with Boris. And I said, Boris, do you know what? I think you'd be a fantastic candidate for the Mayor of London. And he laughed. And he said to me, why would I want to do that? He said, I've got the safest seat in the country, Henley. He said, I've got a fantastic job I love, which is at that time Shadow Secretary for Universities. Why would I want to give all that up and become Mayor of London? I said, because you'd win it and you'd be good. And he laughed, and that was the end of the conversation. And to this day, if you ask Boris Johnson who first suggested to you to stand as Mayor of London, he'll say it was me. So he and I have been mates for quite a while. So again, by chance, I found myself close to. If it had been someone like Andrea Leadsom or something, I'd have probably been out. So by chance, I found myself close to the leader, and so I've stayed in, hang on in there. But I'm very happy to do it because I passionately believe that this country is better governed by the Conservative Party than any other party. And of course, in the last election, it was an absolute no-brainer. The prospect of Jeremy Corbyn was horrific. I personally thought the prospect of Ed Miliband was horrific, and then it got worse. So I was pleased to do my bit.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's all fascinating. I guess you have been involved in the times of Brexit, and do you have any memories or insights into any other things Brexit based? In terms
I'll give you one insight which people don't know, which is that when it was all boiling up, I went to see Mark Regev, who you'll remember was the ambassador, and was a bit of a mate. And I said, Mark, look, I said, I'm a Brexiteer, but the probability at that time is that Remain will win. I mean, if you remember, everybody was certain Remain would win pretty much. And I said, Mark, nearly every country in the world has come out supporting Remain and supporting Cameron in the Remain campaign by publicly stating it. And Israel's been very, very quiet, hasn't said a word. So, I mean, it's not in my interest because I'm a Brexiteer, but in your interest, you should think about coming out and supporting Cameron because he'd appreciate it. And Mark said, well, that's interesting. He said, I haven't actually thought that through. Let me take that back and I'll get back to you. And he called me in a few days later and he said, this has been to Jerusalem. He said, it's been right to the very top. And right at the very top, they've made a decision. They don't want to support the UK remaining in the EU. Don't think it's good for Israel.
Wow.
So I was surprised at, but that was the position. And so they never came out to support the Remain campaign at all, which got slightly lost in the noise. So that was an interesting insight, as it were. And it was a terrible time, and that's why I got so upset with people who called for a second referendum. Do you remember there was a big call for including
people's vote,
including a chap who now leads the Labour Party, who had this brilliant idea that he would want a referendum, but he wouldn't want to vote for it. He'd vote against it, although he voted for it, and the whole peculiar thing he came up with, only a lawyer can do. But a second referendum, I think, would have been disastrous for this country because it split us. So it split. I was the only person in my family who was a Brexit. I was the only person in my office. I was actually the only person in CCHQ, Conservative HQ, who was a Brexiteer. All the staff were Remainers. And so all one did all day long is have arguments with people. And it was just an uncomfortable, very uncomfortable time for the country. The country was unsettled and unhappy. And the prospect of doing that again would be horrific. Yeah. So I lived with it. It was a very hairy, scary time when it first happened, and I got involved in a lot of legislation, emergency legislation we put through. And I remember being in the House of Lords when Lord Callanan said that if we don't get an agreement with the EU, then we'll leave and no deal. And the House of Lords was absolutely shocked. The House of Lords is a very Remainer, left of centre place, so they were all in a grump anyway. And they were in a big grump when they thought we might leave without a deal. So, but we got there. We got there one way or another, just about.
And I'd like to ask our audience as well to remind them that they're free to write in any questions in the comments section, whether you're on Facebook Live or whether you're watching this via US TV, on YouTube, etc. You can always post your comments, and I will pose your questions to Lord Leigh as we reach our conclusion.
Sadly, no cash for questions, but there you
go. Oh gosh. Well, my plan's been thwarted. I wanted to ask you about anti-Semitism because, of course, you recently spoke out in the House of Lords about this, and it must be on your mind given the last few weeks with what's been going on in Israel reflected on these shores. Could you give us some insights into your experiences as a Jew in politics, in public life, and anti-Semitism, and where we're headed?
Well, I have never felt any anti-Semitism from folk in the Conservative Party at all, ever. I felt the reverse. And you know, anti-Semitism is a complicated thing. When I was at school, as I mentioned, there was a Jewish house, and one of the old boys was a fellow called Sir Bernard Whaley Cohen, who was one of the first ever Jewish mayors of London. And he came down to give the boys a talk, and I interviewed him for the house newspaper. And I asked him, well, what in your opinion is the definition of anti-Semitism? He said, well, probably disliking Jews more than is strictly necessary.
Indeed.
The IHRA definition doesn't quite do that. The blessed Eric Pickles managed to get the IHRA definition on. He just stuck it on a government website and it got adopted, and there it was. And I raised a question in the House of Lords as to how many universities had adopted IHRA about a year ago. And the shocking answer then was about 3. So we sprang into action, and the universities minister pushed, and we've got it adopted now in lots of other places. But in recent time, it's very difficult. Whenever I speak on Israel, I always get hate mail, not so much hate mail, but mail from people I've never met trying to educate me as to the plight of the poor Palestinians. And of course, one is sympathetic to the plight of the regular Palestinian. It's just that the answer to their problem is not the destruction of the state of Israel. It's a change in the leadership of the people who are making their lives such misery. And I'm a member of the Conservative Friends of Israel group, and we take MPs out to Israel regularly, and we talk to them, and we show them everything. We also take them to Palestine, by the way, and we take them to the PLO office in Ramallah, so they get a balanced view. They can see for themselves. So anti-Semitism is obviously a threat. I am convinced that this country is not an anti-Semitic country, and the vast majority of people, vast majority of people in this country, are quite sympathetic to Jewish people, as they are every other group. And one of the main reasons Jeremy Corbyn got trashed was because the country was uncomfortable with the perception of anti-Semitism. And it was more than perception. It was institutionally there in their party, and they could see it. And they were not the things like the Chakrabarti report, which was a whitewash, was a disgrace. And you had the most wonderful people like John Mann and Ian Austin give up their job as MPs to stand up and say, and John Mann's not Jewish, to stand up and say, oh, this is an outrage, and I cannot stand for a party that supports this, and give up their seat. I mean, many Jewish MPs didn't give up their seat. They stayed as Labour ticket, which is their prerogative. But for those people who stood up and said, I won't stand for this party, hats off to them. So it's comforting that the core of this country is not anti-Semitic, but there are some growing, I think, far hard left threats. There's obviously there is a problem with Islamic anti-Semitism, and there is a problem with far-right anti-Semitism. But I believe it to be a problem that is in control, and I believe the most important thing is that we have the absolute support of the government in every possible way, and they are doing huge amounts for us, including fighting to save, to have the Holocaust commemoration in Victoria Gardens and other areas. The government could not do more to help the Jewish community and protect the Jewish community.
And in terms of going forward, then I guess in terms of the Conservative leadership, I think one of the things we chatted about in the run-up to this evening was your thoughts on the future. I think you had some insights into that.
Well, I don't know who will be the next leader of the party or the next prime minister, but I do know something. That is the nature and style of the next leader. Because if you go back long, you can go back a long way, say, to Harold Wilson, who was a theatrical type person, followed by Callaghan, who was pretty boring, followed by Thatcher, who was very exciting, followed by Major, who was pretty boring, who was followed by Blair, who was very exciting, who was followed by Brown, who was pretty boring. You're getting a picture here? So every time the candidate oscillates, and the last was Theresa May, who was solid, shall we say, and Boris, who was flamboyant. So the next leader of the party and the prime minister will, in my opinion, be a contrast to Boris. Will be someone solid, steady, reliable, steady Eddie as you go.
Okay, yes, because that's how it works.
There seems to be there's an absolute pattern there from Wilson onwards of every time.
Yes,
what the country wants.
And in terms of the by the way, I wanted to just say that we've had on this show recently this year we've had Ian Austin and also Louise Ellman speaking from different sides of the on the Labour Party who had left and had their thoughts. So what you say is I think resonates interestingly with them and what they did and what they went through. So it's fascinating to hear your point of view from your angle.
Quite a few Labour peers left the Labour whip. They were so upset. I mean, I often ask myself, if my party had been like Labour, would I have stayed in that party? And I'm almost certain, it may be easy for me to say, but I'm almost certain I wouldn't. I couldn't. And not as I say, when something like the Chakrabarti report came out, whitewashing, and when they kept allowing people to do things and they failed to follow up, I don't think I could have stayed. The only argument for staying was that you can do something from inside rather than outside, but I don't find that as persuasive as those people who stood up and said, I'm out of it. And so people like Parry Mitchell, Tony Grabiner, to Alan Sugar, all left the Labour whip and became independent peers. You can't leave, by the way, and become a crossbencher. You have to be accepted by the crossbench convener. So you can apply to be a crossbencher, but if you leave a party, you become non-associated. It's not quite so simple.
Right. And you've said that another great thing about the House of Lords is that you're all peers.
Yes, I mean it's all called the House of Peers. Just people say that, but what does that mean? What it means is that I am, I have a very low rank, or the lowest rank, and the highest rank would of course be a duke, followed by a marquis, followed by an earl, followed by a viscount, followed by a hereditary baron, and the right bottom of the pile is the humble life baron like me, and the hereditaries call us the day boys, and it's interesting that a huge amount of the actual work in the House of Lords is undertaken by the fabulous hereditary peers. And people who call for the abolition of the hereditary peerage don't really understand how the House actually works and who actually does the hard work and puts the muscle and the brain. And they're wonderful people, and they represent the history of the House, right back to the barons who persuaded King John to sign the Magna Carta. And in the House of Lords, there are statues of the barons who signed the Magna Carta when the house was rebuilt in 1860. I don't quite know how they worked out what the barons looked like in 1215, but those are there. And of course, the Magna Carta, which the barons forced King John to sign, included the rights of the Jews to stay in the country. They're specifically in the Magna Carta. Interestingly enough, that it's not in the Magna Carta version of 1297, because by then all the Jews had been expelled. So there's no point having any rights if people didn't live there anymore. But the House of Lords, which was destroyed by fire 1837, was then rebuilt by Pugin and Barry in the 1860s and 1870s, and it is an absolutely superb building. The way it's designed to be so incredibly functional, and how the offices all come together. And Pugin, who did the interior, was convinced that the House of Lords was so much more important than the House of Commons. So he made it much grander, much more important and gilded. And it's an unbelievable chamber. You can walk around and see the coats of arms of barons right back to the 14th century in the actual chamber. And it has a significance. And of course, in the Royal Gallery, where the Queen walks through on the opening of Parliament, there are two enormous paintings by Daclys, one of Battle of Waterloo and one of Battle of Trafalgar, which is why we make the French president give his speech there when he comes to address us. But it is a most exceptional place and a huge honour to be allowed to be there.
I'm sure that's a huge slap in the face for the French leadership.
Oh, topical.
Sorry, it just came into my mind.
And the first time one sits in the House, it's jaw dropping. Actually, it's a very strange thing the first time you sit in the House, which nobody sees, and that's prayers, because the cameras are switched off and nobody else is allowed in. And the very first thing they do for 5 minutes is prayers, and a bishop recites a psalm. And I keep trying to find a psalm that I can persuade them to recite that praises Israel. And then when he's recited the psalm, all the peers turn around and face the wall, and they kneel on their seat and pray. I don't kneel, but those that are Christian do. And we have a full 5 minutes of prayer every day before the House commences debate. And then the purpose of the House is first to hold government to account by questions. And every day we have 4 questions. Then it's to go through legislation, and we go through legislation in outline, and then we go through legislation clause by clause by clause by clause. And frequently there'll be people in the House of Lords who have huge knowledge and experience and expertise in the particular area of legislation. And every single bill we will improve from the bill that the House of Commons comes up with. So we will always be actually changing the bills and improving legislation. And thirdly, to have debates on subjects which need public airing. And the first, so those are the 3 main activities. The first one being questions, and anyone can put a question down on any subject. But the most important thing is the legislation that goes through that is amending. The first time I was in the House of Lords with a bit of legislation going through where there was going to be a division, I sat next to the wonderful Michael Grade, who you may know, and Michael was sitting next to me, and the Lord Speaker stood up. All those content say aye, all those not content. And Michael said, content? Well, he says, I'll make a living.
Classic. And yeah, so I think one question we've got coming in is you're talking about the hard left and Corbyn, etc. How do you see Labour evolving?
Well, as you know, the opinion polls, I always thought that Starmer would be a caretaker, and the opinion polls are proving that he just doesn't cut through. If they were to appoint Andy Burnham, that would be a big threat to us. That would be a big worry. But actually, Labour have nowhere to go. They can't tack left and they can't tack right. What I think they will do now, I think, is that they'll reach the conclusion that they are never going to be in power in the current format, at least in the lifetimes of the people who are there. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to switch tack and they're going to become the champions of proportional representation of some form or another. And I think they're going to work out the only way they can have any form of power is by some sort of alternative vote system. So that's where I think you're going to see them pushing. The Scottish would support that. They've got a big problem with the Scots, obviously, in that they need, at the moment, they need the Scots' support to be in power, and that's only ever going to come with a promise for a referendum. So I think that's where they're going to go. They're going to go to become a PR party. And the Lib Dems would love that, of course, so they'll get support there.
Very interesting. And in terms of your sort of work-life Lord's balance, to what extent are you still in the world of corporate finance, or are you in the Lords every day?
I'm in the Lords about 2 days a week. I'm in senior treasurer of the party, working for about 1 or 2 days a week. I work for my 4 charities I chair for about 3 days a week. And as I tell my employer, I work for them 5 days a week. So it's simple, really.
And in fact, I wanted to pick up on that. The Jerusalem Foundation is one of the foundations you support. Could you tell us a bit about the Jerusalem Foundation?
It's a hidden treasure. The Jerusalem Foundation was started by Teddy Kollek, of whom most people on this call will recall, was the first mayor of Jerusalem. And he was the most amazing mayor because he was very inclusive and he always looked after all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, including the Arabs in East Jerusalem, to the point that Teddy never had any personal security. He went walkabout on his own without anyone having to follow him with a gun. He was that kind of guy, and he knew so many residents. Of course, Jerusalem is the biggest city in Israel and the poorest. And one of the reasons it's the poorest is that every city raises its money by putting rates, taxes on property. Well, in Jerusalem, a third of the properties are exempt because they're yeshivas, schools, mosques, synagogues. So the actual city is poor. So Teddy decided, well, what he's got to do is raise money to do the things that the city would like to do but couldn't afford to do. And he started the foundation. I joined it 30 years ago because I thought it was a great place to organize lots of events and meet lots of Jewish girls. So that seemed a good thing to do. And I organized lots of charity events. And after I'd organized about 20 events, they said to me, oh, would you like to come to a board meeting? And it was pretty intimidating because the great and good of British Anglo Jewry was on the board: Lord Weinstock, Lord Rothschild, Baroness Burke, Sir Harry Ginogly, Lord Weidenfeld, Lord Rain, you name it. And so I joined it, and I was the youngest person on the board. 25 years later, I was still the youngest person on the board, but all the others decided that the time had come to pass the baton to me, and I became chairman of the Jerusalem Foundation. And believe it or not, the foundation has raised, since its inception, well over $1.5 billion, which is a lot. And in the UK, we raised last year $5 million, which is pretty good, and we'll do the same again this year. So it's a big organization, and if you ever, I'm sure you do go to Jerusalem, but when you go to Jerusalem next, once you've seen our little logo, you'll see it everywhere. The idea of the foundation is to stop Jerusalem going black, by which I mean to stop it becoming too Hasidic, or to bring in culture so that young people don't emigrate from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. They would have a reason to stay in Jerusalem. So we built the Khan Theatre, we built the Cinematheque, we built the Botanical Gardens, we built the zoo, we built the Teddy Stadium, all these things, the gardens around the Knesset, so that Jerusalem is a better place to live and work and for people to stay. And it's a fantastic thing to do. If you ever, and every Jew wants to have something in Jerusalem that's connected to themselves. So if you ever want to do something in Jerusalem, be it a row of books or a football stadium, we can do that and everything in between.
Well, I think that the stadium is used by many people. I think when I was in yeshiva, it was quite a black yeshiva, as it were. I think I still, because I used to play for Reading, I had to play in that stadium. So I hope it didn't go against the Jerusalem Foundation.
The story is that Vivian Duffield, Teddy Kollek would never have anything named after him. Nothing would be named after him. That was his rule. And Vivian Duffield went to Teddy and said, "Teddy, I want to build a football stadium, and the only condition is it's called the Teddy Stadium." And he refused, and Vivian walked away. And she meant it. She would only do the stadium if he agreed for it to be the Teddy Stadium. So that is the only building in the whole of Israel that's named after Teddy Kollek.
Wow! 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 Incredible. I just wanted to finish by asking, I guess, a generic question. Of all, you've given us such insight into politics, business, the world of charities, your own personal journey. I know it could be cliched or platitudes, but if there was one or two lessons for life that have been inculcated into you on the way, what do you think they'd be to tell your grandchildren?
Well, actually, the best lesson in life is, of course, the one Jewish. I mentioned that my motto was a Hillel phrase, and the one Hillel phrase that I always remember is essentially teach other people as you would teach yourself. And if you had to distill the Bible into one phrase whilst you stand on one foot, that would be it, wouldn't it? So I do actually think of that, and it's to think long term. Is just to think to yourself. Try and think as much as you can about what's going to happen long term. What are you doing something that's good short term, but how does it work for you in your long term? Because it's amazing how quickly the long term happens. But do unto others as you would have unto yourself is a pretty good one if you had to choose just one phrase.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And I think that is the distillation that the Talmud talks about in terms of that which is hateful to you, don't do to someone else. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. So I think there is, it's at the center, and I think a lot of our Judaism is I guess, exploring the depths of how far that dictum reaches in terms of our life and our relationships.
What I have found is that I've met on my travels a lot of non-Jewish people, obviously, and some of whom, for example, have become my co-treasurers of the party. And as they become friendly with me, I've introduced them to how we do things and to our community and our way of life. And they've all said to me, "Gosh, what a wonderful community you have. How lucky you are to have a group of people who you can turn to and talk to and be with and connect with. And you're so supportive of each other." He said, somebody said to me, I hope you realize how lucky you are to have such a community surrounding you. And it was a very good point.
I can agree with that. I mean, you know a bit about my background, that I didn't come from within the community in terms of my geography and the demographic, I guess the society that I came from, and I discovered my Jewish roots and launched into that way of life when I was 19 or 20 years old. And one of the major attractions was the greatness of the community and belonging and mutual support and a sense of connection, not just in today, but from a common history and a destiny, which was at the core. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that insight. But I think we'll leave it there. It's been an evening to remember. Thank you so much, Lord Leigh, for your time and your generosity of thought, and how open and honest you've been, and in feeding back and sharing with us this evening all those insights in your remarkable life story and your remarkable journey that continues. I'll just leave it. We've got a comment that's just come up from Stan Cohen. Thank you, Rabbi Hughes. Lord Leigh is seriously interesting and a fine example to us all. A phenomenal presentation. So can't get much better than that.
Well, you're very kind, and well done you in all you do for the US and Radlet, as we say in the House of Lords, Kolokopod.
Well, it's good to be sometimes in the House of Lords and sometimes in the Lord's house. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for watching this US in the City episode, and looking forward to joining you next time. Have a good evening. Thank you.